shout out to all of our Patreon supporters out there. Thank you to the Durdle Maniacs. If you want to be a Durdle Maniac, go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles and help support the channel. It keeps things going. It keeps things updated. Thanks so much for watching. On with the show. Michael, can you speak on the origins and the creation for the dojo.com?
All right, so there's this guy named Frank Kusumoto that, if you don't know who he is, hopefully I'll correct that for you. Frank Kusumoto basically invented our concept of a modern internet website, right? So he was an Army intelligence officer screwing around with this thing called the internet, and he happened to like magic. So, so Frank originally did some stuff on Usenet, which included like Sly History and Concepts, if you know that old Usenet article, and he made a website that had Sly History and Concepts, and then also put some versions of Rob Hahn's Schools of Magic on this website, which originally was netcom.com slash tilde F Kusumote was the address, which I still remember. But maybe it was netcom.net. But then eventually he bought the domain for the Magic Dojo. The hilarious thing was he got in it, and hosting and stuff like that was not what it is today. He had a bill for like $20,000 one day after this website went up. And when it started, all it was is he was just appropriating things from Usenet news groups and putting them on a website, it like manually. So there was no concept of, if anybody listening to this knows about modern content management, right? There was no content management system. You hand coded HTML and you stuck things on. And so Frank got all of his quote unquote articles in that era by taking things off of Usenet and republishing them. And after a relatively short period, the dojo became bigger than Usenet. In the beginning, all the content came from Usenet, but then people just started going to the dojo. And so Frank he ran it at least until he wholly owned it and ran it from maybe 1995 to about 1998, I want to say. So I met Frank in the summer of 1998. And that was my first or second experience with professional writing of any kind. So I had written something. He had written Sly History and Concepts. So I wrote like Blue White Control History and Concepts. And that was quickly like the best thing in the dojo, right? So I was like, oh my God, it's the best thing on the dojo. And so I had written this, and then I met Frank at U.S. Nationals that year, and he just gave me like a gigantic like a big duffel bag full of boxes and boxes of Magic the Gathering product. And I'm like, why are you giving this to me? He's just like, well, I make money off of this, so now you make money off of this. And I didn't want to take it. Like I had never taken money for Magic writing before that, but that's kind of what started it for me. And then I became a professional freelance writer for The Duelist. Mark Rosewater gave me my first actual writing contract. What ended up happening was Rob Hahn, the guy who originally wrote Schools of Magic, worked for WotC for a while, and then he decided to go off on his own. He drove from Seattle to Colorado, where Frank lived, and raised a few $1 million, bought the dojo, and decided to have a startup in New York. The original editor-in-chief of the dojo was Frank himself, but the first not Frank editor was Pro Tour champion Dave Price. The original core people were Rob, a guy named Al Tran, who you might know as the protagonist of Springforth, Burley, Protector, and Save Me, one of the greatest tournament reports of all time. We were roommates in Tuna Hua. Rest in peace. One of my best friends at the time. So what was originally Team Discovery Channel was running the Magic Dojo by the summer of 1999. I moved to New York ostensibly for the summer, but then I literally never moved back. It was more fun working in an internet startup at the height of the internet booms than other things. And so we had like a Park Avenue office. Like it was literally like whatever. If you see like movies like Startup.com, that was the life we were living, like going to a lot of parties and stuff like that. And so we had started a network of websites that included Psycomic was the other big one. But the dojo was successfully acquired by a number of folks, and Rob actually, by the Sci-Fi Channel eventually, Rob was actually ended up being the general manager of the Sci-Fi Channel for a minute. So it wasn't a happy ending insofar that none of us all got rich from that, right? So I like to joke that when I was like 23 years old, sleeping on the floor of my COO's apartment, I was already a paper millionaire, but it took me quite a bit longer to be to be any kind of a real millionaire. So we didn't get rich off of the acquisition of the dojo, but we had a lot of life experience, I think, from that. The dojo in 1999 and 2000 was probably not bigger than the websites of today because there's just so many more Magic players, but it was everything to everyone. So, like if you played Magic in any capacity, you probably frequented the dojo every day, right? So all of like the major Magic writers were contributors to the dojo. It had an enormous community element that has never been approximated anywhere else, right? So today, if you go to a content website, you'll see you go to like Cool Stuff Inc. or Channel Fireball or something like that. Like all the content generated there, for the most part, is generated by professional writers who are compensated in some way, and maybe they'll update like 2 or 3 articles a day or something. We were updating hundreds of user submissions or culling stuff from Usenet groups every day. So it was like a community amount of content to the degree that has never been seen by any other site since. And then in addition, we had kind of a professional contingent. Our biggest challenge, I think, was we knew that casual play was where the preponderance of Magic players were at, but we didn't know how to generate content for them. Like if Commander existed, I probably really would have been a millionaire at at 23, because we would have figured out how to give content to them, right? So all we knew how to do was like pay a pro player to tell you how to do a draft order, right? Like that was the best thing we could do. And so we understood that people were like playing on kitchen table or playing freeform rules or didn't care how many copies of whatever the 1999 equivalent of Fable of the Mirror Breaker was that they could have in their deck. But all of us, every single one of us who was on staff came out of the tradition of tournament play, right? So if you think about like an Ascension standpoint, where it's like, well, everybody starts off as like a casual player or a kitchen table player, or they have like, I have 7 terrors and 9 lightning bolts in my deck. Well, why don't you have 10 lightning bolts in your deck? I only own 9. Right? Like we all came out of kind of that tradition, but our version of becoming more serious at Magic was to play in a structured way, or to start playing in tournaments, and start playing by other people's rules, or learning about technology from Japan or other geographic regions of the United States from Usenet. So like there was only one kind of ascension path, and again, if Commander existed, I probably would have had a very different life path. But it didn't, and the dojo eventually went away. And I think that one of the big reasons for that was the dojo was a content website, right? So it made money from sponsorships and advertising, but like not nearly enough money, right? So if I told you like we sold like $5 or $10 or even $15,000 in advertising sponsorships for a month, right? Like that was an enormous amount for us to get relative to the traffic that we had at the time, and that is nowhere near enough to pay for our staff, right? So like if you compare that to like a company like Star City Games, right, in Roanoke, Virginia, like they have content, right? And that they charge people for their content in some way, shape, or form, but they're an e-commerce website, right? Like, Pete Hoffling has tens of millions of dollars of Magic the Gathering product that he buys and sells, and the SC people are like, oh, the SCG tour, that's where like they travel around and have Magic tournaments. Like, no, that's where they travel around and buy product for their website, and like they get you to go there so they can buy your cards that they're going to go sell at 2 to 3 times markup off the internet by having a tournament that they charge you to play in, right? It's an ingenious business model, right? People think that they're going for a tournament. They are going to donate their Magic cards to somebody who lives somewhere else through this intermediary of the internet, right? And so that's a real business, right? It's a real way that you would have a Magic website. We did not have a real business. We had, this is a very funny story. This is a true story. Me, Altran, and Tuna are in the living room of our CEO COO, which was in the Greenwich on 50th and 8th Avenue, which is like the building above where Wicked is currently playing on Broadway. And we come in, 3 college-aged Asian guys on card tables, on laptops. 2 guys in suits walk in, look around the room, see 3 Asian guys on computers, and hand Stefano Kim a check for $2 million. That was the due diligence in the summer of 1999. I'm not kidding when I say that, right? So, like, it was a different world, but we couldn't sustain that business with, like, $5,000 in ad sales, right? It's like not even one person's salary.
Yeah.
So, it was a thing that was beautiful. When Rob was running it himself, no, I'm sorry, not Rob. When Frank was running it himself, it was entirely a labor of love, but Frank couldn't run it himself, right? Like, it had gotten too big for one person to run, and Frank needed to get out, right? He needed to put this in the hands of somebody who could resource it a little bit better. I think that if we just had a better business, but who knew? Like, back then, like, message boards were IPOing for tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So we're like, oh, our thing's better than a message board. It's like a message board, and Brian Hacker writes for us. So it was it was not a real business. Although we pretended it was. Does that answer your question? It was everything to everyone.
This is great because I'll be able to chop this up to a bunch of different things.
It has all these classic articles. It has Clear the Land and the Fundamental Turn. It has various versions of Schools of Magic. It has Who's the Beatdown?
Yeah, well, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is, Who's the Beatdown is one of the most famous articles in Magic history. What inspired you to write it? This episode is brought to you by Tales of Adventure. Go to toamagic.com and use the code Durdles for 5% off your order. You'll be directly supporting the show, and you'll get the entire order in one package. No more waiting for several packages. That's toamagic.com, code Durdles for 5% off.
The secret origin of Who's the Beatdown. All right, so true story. I road tripped over spring break in 1999. And so I was living in Ohio in my parents' basement in the 1999, the year before I moved to New York. And so I often just like road tripped for long weekends to New York to visit my friends, or to like Philadelphia to visit my old roommates. And coincidentally, that was always when there was a Magic tournament, right? So it took like 2 weeks, came to Philadelphia, came up to New York, came back down to Washington, D.C., actually, stayed with John Schuler, the inventor of the Magic the Gathering tournament report, for a weekend in D.C. And the Philly guys came down to D.C. to play in a PTQ. I ended up making top 8 of that PTQ with a High Tide deck. And my future roommate, one of my best friends, original Dojo character, Al Tran, was playing for top 8 in a matchup. He was playing a white weenie, like a 5-color white weenie deck that Landy Ho, you might also know that, multiple Grand Prix top 8 competitor Landy Ho had won a qualifier with. So Al was playing Land's white weenie deck, and he was playing against the Sly deck, right? He was playing against a red deck. So what ended up happening was Al made the cardinal mistake that no one should ever make, which is that he lost the roll, and his opponent played a first turn Jackal Pup, and Al's got a Swords to Plowshares in his hand, and I'm thinking, like, just open mana, just send this over here. But he's greedy. He wants to save his a Lightning Bolt for the Jackal Pup. Long story short, the Jackal Pup does a ton of damage. Al ends up having to plow it anyway, and then he takes a ball lightning to the jaw. Everything goes wrong, right? And I hope I'm remembering that right. If you read Who's the Beatdown, you probably have a more precise thing. This has been 25 years for me. But it's something like this, right? So a Jackal Pup and a ball lightning versus a Swords to Plowshares when you're waiting on a Lightning Bolt is really the setup here. And I realized at the time, kind of coincidentally with a matchup I had played earlier in the day, where my opponent was playing Counter Sliver, and he had gotten a Crystalline Sliver in play. Then he tapped out for Worship on turn 4, and he's like, I got my combo. And I'm like, well, I'm playing High Tide, so I killed him. And his combo doesn't do anything. And I realized in that PTQ that people, it's not that they don't understand how their deck works. They don't necessarily understand how their deck works in context, right? So Crystalline Silver Worship doesn't do anything if your opponent is playing High Tide, right? They're going to kill you with Stroke of Genius, which doesn't deal damage. Because it doesn't deal damage, Worship doesn't protect you from going down to 0. That's not how you lose. And the same thing, Al didn't understand that he wasn't the aggressor, right? So a white weenie deck, Savannah Lions and Lightning Bolt and Soltari Priest, like that's the aggressive deck, but not in this context. His opponent has Jackal Pup, which is offensively just as fast as Savannah Lions. He's got Ball Lightning, which is faster. He's got Fire Blast to finish the game. Al actually has to use his resources to not get run over, not to try to run his opponent over. Right. And if you think about like things like his mana base becomes a potential liability, right? Like maybe he's taking damage from his lands, maybe his lands just don't come out perfectly because he's not one color. Right. So I just saw this. I'm like, both the Crystal and Silver guy and Al missed, like, it's not that they didn't understand how their deck worked if they were playing against a blank screen, right? But they didn't understand how their deck worked in the context that they were sitting in front of. And I came to figure something out, which was that if that's the case, right, what if all deck assignment, what if all deck roles, what if all decks exist on a spectrum of fluidity, not in like hard spots, right? Just like, okay, I'm playing Suicide Black, I'm the beatdown. Well, you're not always the beatdown, right? Like, I'm playing Blue-White Control, I'm the control, right? Like, no, you're not always the control, right? Like, how does your deck interact with a combo deck? Right? How does your, people are like, oh, well, there's this paradigm of combo and control and beatdown. I'm like, well, okay, let's say I'm a control deck, right? I'm a red-white deck that's just nothing but creature removal. Like, you're not very controlling when you're playing against a blue-white deck that has counterspells, right? You're not very controlling if you're playing against a mid-range green-white Urnimjin deck that can cast the card Armageddon, right? Like, you're literally not controlling anything. You're just getting your whole board blown up, even though you have nothing but creature removal. So I was just like, well, if all of these things exist on a spectrum, then what we have to do is think about how do we contextualize the deck that we're playing in front of us against the opponent that we're playing. And once we figure out what that context should be, how does that potentially adjust how we should play, right? And so obviously this has had a lasting impact on how people think about Magic, right? And I think that the simplest thing to say about it is there's just not fixed positions in space, right? Everything's fluid, and that the greatest skill is figuring out where you are on the spectrum, and by figuring that out, you will have the best chance of making the best decisions on a go forward basis, right? So just in the modern world, my friend Lanny Huang, who I have a podcast with right now, Spy Colony, I was trying to explain how to play Burn to a kid at a local tournament. I said, look, a lot of people sit down and they look at their hand and they start making the wrong decision at turn X, and Landy's like, no, they start making the wrong decision on turn 1, right? And the reason is they just don't understand the fundamental context of how their deck works when they're sitting down in a certain spot, right? And you gain a lot of percentage once you figure that out correctly, right? And the best example I can think of is when people make fun of Burn players and they're just like, oh, did a really great job of dealing 17, right? They dealt 17 because they played wrong, right? So they're like, they're just aiming to the face, or they're not aiming to the face, they're aiming at creatures, right? You have to figure out what the right thing to aim at is at the right speed, and then you're going to win a whole lot more. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah. Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy, and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned. We kind of went backwards on the answers. So now what I want to ask you then is, in the context of other Magic theory at the time, how did this change the game?
Oh, great question. So sometimes people ask me if I knew Who's the Beatdown was like a great article when I wrote it. And the answer was I was really high on this article called Investment that I'd written in 1998. Nobody's ever heard of Investment, but I thought it was just fantastic. It was this whole thing about how to count cards. And I wrote Who's the Beatdown, and I sent it in, and I thought it was pretty good. But the biggest like strategy article that was of any consequence at the time was Schools of Magic by Rob Hahn. I realized within 3 days that I had written the second best Magic article of all time at a minimum because I had already changed the language. So I found out people emailed me. People emailed instead of texted back then. Nobody had mobile phones. You're just like, people are just, they're not talking about your article. They are talking your article, right? Like they were at tournaments that weekend and they're like, oh, who's the beatdown, right? And I was just like, that had already changed the language, right? So by the summer of 1999, because I worked for Rob, right? So I was just like, oh, you wrote the best one. I only wrote the second best one. It took me a long time to figure that, like, it was that how lasting and important it was. And I think that the thing that was different or important about it is that not that Who's the Beatdown is so ingenious in and of itself, but I kind of created this subgenre of taking magic thought seriously and systematically that didn't exist before. So if you look at schools of magic, it categorizes things, right? It categorizes things, but it mostly describes them. It does not actually create analysis or synthesis in the way that Who's the Beatdown is. Who's the Beatdown creates a framework by which people can contextualize their own play, discuss things, and form strategic decisions that will be lasting for them elsewhere. So I'm sure other people have done similarly important things in other genres. I happen to have written that one thing and brought it to magic, right? So if someone would have written something that did the same thing and brought it to magic if it wasn't me. I just happened to have been an active writer at the time and early enough that no one else had done it yet. Because I honestly don't think Who's the Beatdown is so ingenious in the abstract. But
one more thing I wanted you to speak on is kind of comparing what magic articles were to what Who's the Beatdown was.
Well, before Who's the Beatdown, like I said, the best magic article that was written before Who's the Beatdown was probably Schools of Magic by Rob, and Rob wrote and rewrote Schools of Magic many times. So he's constantly kept it fresh. But it was like really, it's kind of like a metagame breakdown in a time when the metagame didn't move as fast, right? So that was that. And then John Schuler, who I think I mentioned elsewhere in this interview, kind of had invented the tournament report. So tournament reports already existed before I started playing seriously. And people basically would go play in a PTQ, talk about their deck. Sometimes they'd put their deck list. Oftentimes they wouldn't because decks were secret back then. But they would describe their deck and they would describe the path that they took to usually to winning. People didn't typically write a tournament report if they didn't win. And one of the things that was super inspirational to me was Rob actually wrote a tournament report for a PTQ that he won. And I really wanted to be a professional Magic player. I really wanted to, like, I'm good enough or whatever. And I'd never played in a PTQ, but I really wanted to be a professional Magic player. And so I had this correlation in my head. And I was just like, oh, well, I know who this guy is because I've read Schools of Magic. And I was like, oh, so there's this correlation between writing good Magic articles or writing good Usenet posts, really. There was no Dojo yet, so there was no other websites yet. Writing good Usenet posts and then sharing your information and then being good at Magic. And so, like, I had this equation in my head by winter of 1995, right? So that was in my head before I had ever played in a Magic tournament. So you think about, like, what Magic content was. Most of the good Magic content was on Usenet, and rec.tradingcards.magic.strategy was the most frequented one, although, like, Brian Hacker posted in .misc, I think. So that a lot of that was there, or you bought books. So, like, George Baxter wrote books. I own books that were written by George Baxter. And so that's, yep, there you go. So that's where there was no Magic articles. I don't know what the first Magic article would be. Like, even I think back, like, Brian Weissman wrote a primer on how to play Urza's Block Limited for the Dojo. It was the first ever sponsored Dojo post. I followed it and I top forwarded a PTQ that weekend after reading Brian Weissman's. That was the very first one. I don't know that I would even count that as an article. It was just like a glorified Usenet post that Frank had paid for and stuck on the Dojo instead of, like, just circumvented Usenet, right? Or I guess you could say, like, I guess there were magic articles in the Duelist, but they're not really written in with a high level strategic mindset in mind. And the other thing is, like, the people who were writing them were super biased, and like, Baxter also was like writing from a very biased position. Like, people talk about deck lists being Baxterized. Like, Baxter would like intentionally make the deck lists worse in his books, so as to not give away technology. Like, I have a really strong memory of an early issue of the Duelist that talked about a three-way, like a 33%, 33%, 33% metagame breakdown between Necropotence, Green-White Armageddon, and Red-Green Jockelhops decks. There was no 33% Red-Green Jockelhops decks, right? Like, they're like, oh, well, imagine this is the metagame, right? Like, I'm like a child, and I'm like, oh, is this a metagame? Like, this is burned into my head. Like, it's 30 years later, and I still remember this. So you basically had people who were like doing well at the national level or winning PTQs, right? Because there wasn't even that much Pro Tour yet, right? But there were like, there'd been like one Pro Tour or something like that, maybe two Pro Tours, and people were winning constructed PTQs. We're just getting like the opportunity to write, or Baxter was writing, and they were all writing lies. Like, that's the thing. Like, they were writing bad deck. Go look at Deep Magic. Like, look at the deck. Like, Baxter was a good Pro Tour player. He never played any of the decks that he would have put in one of his books. Never, right? Like, so and that's not, it was a different world. Like, the amount of information that we have is completely different than it is today. So it's hard to lay judgment. I'm just saying, from the perspective of what Magic quote unquote articles were back then, people weren't giving up their deck lists. When they were lying. And there wasn't really any transparency. The best content was some kind of theoretical strategic stuff coming from Rob, and tournament reports. And there weren't a lot of tournament reports yet. So Jamie Wakefield was writing them. John Schuler was writing them. Rob wrote some. But, they hadn't become the art form. By 97, I'd already played my first Pro Tour at this point. But by 97, I think Brian Hacker had perfected the tournament report. But and Who's the Beatdown comes out in 99. So there was Hacker already. Hacker's the best.
For the gift that keeps on giving all year round, join our Patreon at patreon.com/eternaldurdles. And hey, check out this playlist we got up here with all of our interviews over the last couple of years. Some great people from the Legacy community, some really great guests.